read through the chapter. I'm going to attempt to get through this chapter. I'm going to try to really cover it from a more high-level perspective. Won't be diving into too many really detailed things. But Genesis 38, an interesting pause in the story of Joseph. And probably as we read this chapter, you're going to go, huh? But I think there's some interesting lessons there. So let's go ahead and read it together. And it came about at that time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. And he took her and went into her. So she conceived and bore a son, and he named him Then she conceived again and bore a son and named him Onan. She bore still another son and named him Shelah. And it was at Kezib that she bore him. Now Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord took his life. The Judah said to Onan, go in to your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her and raise up offspring for your brother. Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so when he went into his brother's wife, he wasted his seed on the ground in order not to give offspring to his brother. But what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, so he took his life also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought, I'm afraid that he too may die like his brothers. So Tamar went and lived in her father's house. Now, after a considerable time, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. And when the time of mourning was ended, Judah went up to his sheep shears at Timnah, he and his friend Hira, the Adullamite. It was told to Tamar, behold, your father-in-law is going to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she removed her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil and wrapped herself and sat in the gateway of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah had grown up and she had not been given him as a wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, here now, let me come in to you. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, what will you give me that you may come in to me? He said, therefore, I will send you a young goat from the flock. She said, moreover, will you give a pledge until you send it? He said, what pledge shall I give you? And she said, your seal and your cord and your staff that is in your hand. So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and departed and removed her veil and put on her widow's garments. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend, the Adullamite, to receive the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. He asked the man of her place, saying, where is the temple prostitute who was by the road at Enaim? They said, there has been no temple prostitute here. So he returned to Judah and said, I did not find her. And furthermore, the man of the place said, there has been no temple prostitute here. Judah said, let her keep them, otherwise we will become a laughing stock. After all, I sent this young goat, but you did not find her. Now it was about 3 months later that Judah was informed, your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot, and behold, she is also with child by harlotry. Then Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. It was while she was being brought out that she sent to her father-in-law, saying, I am with child by the man to whom these things belong. And she said, please examine and see whose signet ring and cords and staff are these. Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not have relations with her again. It came about at the time she was given birth, that behold, there were twins in her womb. Moreover, it took place while she was giving birth. One put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, this one came out first. But it came about as he drew back his hand, that behold, his brother came out. Then she said, what a breach you have made for yourself. So he was named Perez. Afterward, his brother came out, who had the scarlet thread in his hand, and he was named Zerah. What do you do with a story like that? Kind of strange, right? And furthermore, for those of us who were kind of getting excited and getting into the story of Joseph, this side story seems to slow down the story of Joseph. But I think it is included here because it is a part of Jacob's family. And when you look back to 37, verse 2, 37:2 says, these are the records of what? Of the generations of Jacob. So 38 is another part of that. Judah, as we will find out here in a few chapters, is going to carry the blessing of the firstborn of Jacob. And so this is kind of a story that looks at him. Furthermore, what we know from the rest of the Old Testament and the New Testament, we know the significance of Judah, right? Not only is he the one from whom David came, but we know a very famous descendant of David who also came from the tribe of Judah, and that's Jesus. And so that's why Judah plays a very significant role, and that's why we are looking at his story here. In chapter 37, when we started with Joseph, Joseph was 17. He was a teenager, though this concept is foreign to all the other countries in the world outside of the United States. And what I mean by that is that everything that comes with the concept of teenager is not present elsewhere around the world. But Joseph was just 17 and 37, right? But when the family moves to Egypt in chapter 46, Tamar's sons are included in that story. So we can we need to see what happens, and we need to get this story as well. Now, Judah enters the scene as a cold and selfish man who has cast aside Abraham's God-given vision for a covenant people. And we also see how God transforms him in these 20 plus years. That's kind of the period that we see here in chapter 38. It's a period of about 20 years or so. And I think the reason, while we're kind of looking at the significance of this particular story here in 38, I think it's also included here to show the significance of the Joseph narrative. What do you mean by that? Well, Joseph is the favorite heir apparent and the younger son, and he was apparently removed by his brothers for good and sold off to Egypt. But when Judah, the new leader of the brothers, refused to give his younger son to the widow Tamar, she took matters into her own hands. As a result, twins were born to Judah with circumstances that were very reminiscent of Jacob and Esau. The second infant forced his way to the fore, signifying that the younger would rise to prominence. And so the repetition of this type of motif here stresses that God's design for Joseph's prominence could not be set aside as easily as Judah thought by just selling Joseph off. And we talked about it last week. You can't frustrate God's plan by getting rid of the one that God or trying to push aside, trying to slide over the one that God had pushed forward or the one that God selected, and instead place yourself in their place. That's just not how God's plan works. And Judah learns that here. In his own family, in spite of his indifference to Tamar, Judah saw the strange outworking of the plan whereby the younger gain priority in the family. So it's just God's plan, right? And God's story is very, very interesting. Well, let's go ahead and pick this story apart a little bit. The first 5 verses, we see the first point. It's very simple. Judah rebelliously takes a Canaanite wife and has 3 sons by her. Now, why do I say Judah rebelliously takes Canaanite wife? Well, it's simple. When God called Abraham to come to the promised land, what did God make really clear to Abraham about the choice of a wife for Isaac? He said, don't take her from this land, not from the Canaanites, right? So Abraham sends 10 camels, 500-mile journey, which today, for most of us, that's a considerable journey. But minus cars and modern highways and all the other things, by camel, that's more than a considerable journey. That's an insane journey. But that's what Abraham does to obey God's plan. Likewise, under a little bit of a different set of circumstances, but still Jacob, when it's time for him to find a wife, makes the same journey, minus 10 camels on foot, but still makes the same journey, 500 miles to go find himself a wife. And so God's mind on this, God's will on this, had been made very clear and passed on from generation to generation so far. Don't intermarry with Canaanites. But Judah rebels against God's plan. And so rebelliously, he takes a Canaanite wife and has 3 sons by her. He is the first of his brothers to lower himself by seeking relations with Canaanites. As we mentioned, this act was out of harmony with the will of the patriarchs not to marry Canaanite women. And you know what's interesting? If you want to know what God thinks about something, look at the details of the story. You want to know one detail of the story? Look at the first 2 verses of this chapter and tell me what Judah's wife's name was. I'm waiting. Yeah, you can't tell me what Judah's wife's name was. You know why? Because Judah's wife's name is not mentioned in that story. All she's identified as is the daughter of Shua. And later in the story, when she died, she was also identified as the daughter of Shua, who passed away. You want to know what God thought about Judah's rebellious decision to go and marry with Canaanites? God didn't think it was a good idea. God didn't approve of it. And the way we know that he didn't approve of it was that she enters history as a woman with no name. We do not know who she is. God didn't think it was important enough for us to know her name. So throughout generations, we never know her name. Why? Because Judah should have never done it. And God makes it really clear to all the generations after and all of those who, like you and I, would be reading his word, what he actually thinks about that. I think it's very interesting. The other piece that's really interesting, I think, in verse 2, look at how Judah's attraction or how Judah's choice of her is described. He saw her, he took her, he went into her. There seems to be a very kind of a one-sided guidance by physical attraction as opposed to any kind of concern for God's will or for God's idea, for God's decision, for God's thinking on this. He is guided by his physical attraction, and that's the only thing that he cares about. He sees her, takes her, goes into her, right? So again, what is Judah doing? He rebelliously goes down the path that God specifically told his father and his father's father and his father's father's father not to go down that path. From this marriage, Judah has 3 sons. And that brings us to verses 6 through 11, where the second point is that not only does Judah rebelliously take a Canaanite wife and has 3 sons by her, but the second point is Judah promotes disobedience with his son. and reaps consequences of his actions. Judah promotes disobedience with his son and reaps consequences of his actions. What do I mean by that? Why do I say Judah promotes disobedience with his son? Well, look what Judah does in verse 6. He took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. Where did he take a wife from? Same place where he found a wife for himself. So not only is he aligning himself with the Canaanite, he marries who God didn't want him to marry, but now he takes another Canaanite woman and he gives her to his son. So he kind of continues he sets his son on the same path, on the same rebellious, evil path, and reaps the consequences of his actions. What do we know about his oldest son? We don't know much about him. We know that his name was We know that scripture describes him as evil. I think it's very interesting that the Hebrew word for evil is a reverse of the consonants used in Hebrew for Er's name. So it's there's a little bit of a word play in Hebrew here, and it's very interesting. That's the extra color that you get when you get an opportunity to look at the Bible in the original languages. That's the kind of stuff that you don't see when you're just reading it in English. But we don't know what Er's offense is precisely. We don't know how he died precisely. What we do know is in Genesis 6, for example, the whole population was evil and God destroyed them with a flood. We also know in Genesis 19, the wicked people of Sodom were also overthrown by the with the evil people before him. And our text describes his judgment as God's justice. This is the first time in the Bible where we see this take place on an individual level, where God wipes out an individual as a way of judging this individual. Now, later in Leviticus chapter 10, the first 7 verses of that chapter, we will see Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's 2 oldest boys, getting equally judged by God. There we know what they did. They publicly dishonored God. They were in the positions of leadership. They were in the positions of priesthood. They were supposed to represent God to the people and represent the people to God. And and God clearly identified to the people how he's to be approached. And they said, yeah, blah, 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 blah. I know you said all that, but who cares? We're just going to come to you on our own terms. And God said, no, you don't. A fire from heaven comes, it consumes them on the spot. So God very decisively deals with them because they very carelessly dealt with him. And had God not dealt with them the way he dealt with them, what Israel would have learned was that here's everything that God said, but here's how these guys approached him and nothing happened to them. So God must not have meant any of this stuff. And so the whole Old Testament law basically would have been just like chunked over because God doesn't really care about all of this stuff. So God had to deal with the two. But that's Leviticus chapter 10. That's not until a little bit longer, a little bit later, I guess. So, but now in our story here, Judah directs Onan, his second son, to fulfill his obligation to his brother, but he was evil too, and God took him also. By the local custom, and later the Old Testament law of levirate marriage, what happens is, and in the Old Testament, by the way, a brother is forbidden to marry his brother's widow, unless that widow was childless. And so that's called levirate law. And apparently this had existed even before the Old Testament law, before the Mosaic law. This had existed as a local custom as well. where if your older brother dies childless, the younger brother takes his wife in order to continue his line, so that his line doesn't die off there, so that he has descendants by his wife. When Alice and I first got married, we traveled to Russia for the first time together. And when my younger brother, who, I don't know, he was 12 or something like that at the moment, he met Alice for the first time. He was really excited, and he told her that, under the Old Testament law, if anything ever happened to me, he would be the next in line to marry her. So anyway, I think he had forgotten that this was no Old Testament law, and I could still take him out. But anyway, it was funny. I just thought it was funny that there's one part of the Bible that he knew really well, and he was very, very quick to show off his knowledge of that part of the Bible. Well, anyway, but yeah, that's where we are here. And so in this particular situation, as Judah tells his second son, Onan, to take Tamar, there is really no purpose for the second marriage other than to ensure that the line of the deceased would continue through his widow. That's the idea, right? But Onan had no such plan. He was willing to use the custom to have Tamar, but since he was unwilling to raise up a child through it, he would regularly spill his seed on the ground. And the way we know that is the word whenever in Hebrew here. It's an indication that this was a repeated offense. He didn't do it once. That was a repeated. So what he was doing is he was gratifying his physical needs, but he was unwilling to do what was right for his brother. And so here is another wicked member of the family who would use the law to gratify the flesh, but was unwilling to take responsibility contained in the custom. This attitude of gratification without responsibility has been repeated from generation to generation in immoral people. And we see it all too often today. That's why abortion is a big solution for being able to gratify without responsibility. That's the ultimate solution in people's minds, gratification without responsibility. And by the way, I want to tell you something. Abortion is never the right choice, whether it's at 6 weeks or at 20 weeks or at 40 weeks, okay? It is never the right choice. It is always, no matter how you phrase it, it is always taking a life that God creates. Psalm 139 makes it very clear that that's what it is, and there's nothing else that we can do to kind of recast it in any other light. And but God wouldn't have it. Just like he did with he also wouldn't have it with Onan. And so this kind of selfishness and sexual gratification displeased God, and Onan's life was snuffed out as well. But I want to pause for just a second before we go to kind of the next part of the story. I just want to show you something. This is really interesting. Lest you think that our actions as parents have no consequences, have no result, I guess, have no bearing, right, on the actions of our kids. This story corrects that. This story fixes that. This story controverts that, because Judah clearly careless about God's word. And so he goes down and he takes a wife out of Canaanite women, clearly disobeying, rebelling against God. And look at how that translates. Look at what that looks in the next generation. Not only does he rebel himself, he sets his children up for rebellion. His children come out of that rebellious union. Then he sets them up for rebelling by procuring another Canaanite woman for his oldest and then his middle. And as we set our children, as our children watch us disobey God and rebel, what do you think they're going to do? And that's exactly what happens. Judah's rebellion results in his son being so evil. See, Judah was not so evil ever that God just took out Judah. God never took out Judah, right? Judah was allowed to remain. But Judah's rebellion, and that's how always, by the way, that's how it always works. Unconfessed sin ends up growing and ends up becoming bigger and becoming more, right? And so Judah's rebellion grew into something so despicable and disgusting that God had to snuff it out. And I just want to make sure that we're clear that little things that we do, little sins that we allow, it never remain that way in the next generations. And it's just a good reminder. And I always say, I'm not just saying it to y'all, I'm speaking to myself. And it's convicting just to think about that, I mean, we have lots of country songs, right? About our kids watching what we say. One just recently I was listening to where a guy singing about his son, saying something, his young boy sitting in the back seat and saying something really, a choice word. And he said, where'd you learn that, son? And he said, I heard you say, Dad, I want to be just like you. And it was such a convicting thing, right? In that country song to that singer, he said, oh, yeah, he does listen. He does want to be just like me. And that's just such a good reminder. I mean, you can see that right here in this story. And so Onan dies, and because again, he is also being evil. And now we are, and that kind of takes us through verse 11. And at the end of verse 11, we also see Judah being selfish. First was evil, God took him. Then Onan was selfish and evil, and God took him. And now Judah is being selfish. What do I mean by that? Judah's selfish actions toward Tamar condemned her to a life of childless abandonment. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, Judah is being selfish by not wanting to take care of her. The fact that he procured her for his children, even if she was to wait for the younger child, it was Judah's responsibility to provide for her. For him to send her back as a widow into her father's house, that was just basically saying, I don't want to take care of you. I'm releasing my responsibility. But you know what he didn't release? Well, later in the story, we'll learn that when he says, bring her out to be burned, he didn't release her authority over her because he still views her as belonging to Sheila. Why else would he say, bring her out and we're going to punish her for her harlotry? Harlotry against whom, Judah? Her first two husbands are dead. Harlotry against Sheila, whom Judah considers her to be basically betrothed to. So what Judah is doing here is having his cake and eating it too. He's sending her back to her dad to take care of her, but still maintaining this legal authority over her as the widow belonging to his household. Selfish Judah. That's what he is doing here. But then the text also tells us in verse 11 that Judah, while he sends her back to his father's house, does he have any intention of actually giving Sheila to her? No. Verse 11 tells us clearly that he doesn't. Look at it. He says, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Sheila grows up. That's what he says to her. But here's what he's thinking. This is what we as the readers are invited into his thoughts. For he thought, I'm afraid that he too may die like his brother. So what's he thinking? He's thinking, no way am I going to give Sheila to her. So what Judah is actually doing, like parents have since then and to this day, and I see this on a daily basis, as parents, sometimes we tend to excuse the actions of our own children and blame others for the issues that our kids actually have. And that's exactly what Judah is doing there. He doesn't bother to objectively review the evidence or seek God's face on this, God's thoughts on this. He doesn't care to think about the fact that, look, Judah, if Tamar was the problem, wouldn't God have taken Tamar? Wouldn't he have taken her and not your boys, your first boy, and then your second boy, Judah? You really should look in the mirror, Judah, instead of blaming indirectly Tamar for that. But that's what he does. So what he's doing is he is desperately trying to protect his youngest. And, and he kind of sends off Tamar while still maintaining this responsibility. It's interesting because God's people often complicate his program by their failure or refusal to fulfill their responsibilities. And we can kind of see what Judah is doing here. In Judah's family, the complications were caused by the failure and the refusal of the man in the family to live obediently to God's laws and to fulfill their responsibility faithfully. And this brings us to the final point, the third point, verses 12 through 30. Judah's refusal to do what's right encourages Tamar to deception for conception. Judah's refusal to do what's right encourages Tamar to deception for conception. God's people often resort to desperate, deceptive actions to ensure the success of what they know to be right. Judah, unfortunately, as the story continues to show off his true colors. And just when we thought that we saw the worst, he stoops even lower by allowing his flesh to once again get the best of him, this time by going into prostitute. That's what we learned here in verse 12, or verse 12 and down. So what happens in verse 12? Judah's wife dies. We don't know her name. We just know that she was Shua's daughter. And so now the time of mourning is ended. Judah goes up to his sheep shearers at Timnah. That's usually a time for celebration when you're shearing, kind of a big party, shearing your sheep. And Tamar is informed that Judah is doing that. And she puts her plan into action. But in verse 14, at the very end of 14, why does she plan her plan? Why did she put her plan into action? Well, we learned that she saw that Shelah had grown up and she had not been given to him as a wife. She realized that what Judah told her was never going to happen. And she felt at this particular point, right or wrong, she felt like, she had no other option basically of doing this particular plan. Now it's interesting because what she does is wrong, but the scripture never explicitly condemns her in this action. And verse 15, we learned, as I already mentioned, that when Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot. And then as the story kind of continues, it's interesting too, because he doesn't plan for it. How do you know that Judah kind of goes by the seat of his pants? He's not planning on this. How do we know this? He doesn't have a payment. He has to promise her to send a payment later. So we know this was kind of he just saw her and she has to cover her face to make this happen. But it's interesting too, by the way, and there's several other things going on in this story. I'm really not going as deep, but there are several different layers to the story too. In that society, a wife, a concubine, and a temple prostitute were considered higher class, right? And but kind of a common whore, prostitute, was considered a much lower class. Well, it's interesting because there are two different Hebrew words that are being used. One is for a common whore, prostitute, which is what Judah thinks he sees in verse 15. Now, I don't know if this is what's going on, but it's possible that in his mind, he thought, well, this is the better of the two evils because at least I'm not going into a temple prostitute where there may have to be some worshiping of idols involved in that whole thing. And so maybe he thinks, that that's better. But it's interesting because later, when he sends his friend Hira to deliver the payment, right? I just think it's interesting. Hira doesn't ask the local man about a prostitute. He asks him about a temple prostitute. So in my mind, it almost seems like Hira thought better of Judah, as far as he thought that, he would not be associated with that low of a class of woman. He thought that, at least he would have a temple prostitute. So it's just kind of an interesting interplay going on there. All of that is gross. So I'll just kind of keep going with that. But it's interesting. Tamar is taking a great risk to obtain what was her right. When the time was right, after the death of Judah's wife, she lured Judah into what was for him an immoral union with a prostitute. So we talked about that, her ploy. She covers her face. By so doing, she may have, like I said, satisfied the scruples of Judah, who would turn aside to the prostitute, but perhaps not to the temple prostitute. And then Tamar conceives in this whole situation. She did what justice and the death of her husband demanded of her, but by a very dangerous scheme. And we also mentioned that the text of scripture does not cast any moral judgment on Tamar. That's very, very interesting. She gets a deposit from him, his seal, his staff, his cords. These are personal things that were kind of individual to every person. And he leaves, sends the payment back. And it's interesting when, no one is found, when the payment cannot reach its intended recipient. He is very quick to want to just kill the whole thing. He's afraid that they're going to be made a laughing stock of kind of the whole situation. It's interesting here. Someone pointed out that when men are not governed by the Spirit of God, they're always more worried about the opinion of the world than about the judgment of God. And I think it's just a really interesting reminder here of kind of how Judah is acting. And then when Tamar's pregnancy is discovered, it was told to Judah that she had prostituted herself and had gotten pregnant by her prostitution. Judah is quick to condemn others for the sins that he also committed. And look at his character here, or lack thereof, really. Because when it was revealed that he was implicated, Judah exonerates himself, doesn't he? He doesn't say, oh, we both are now guilty of being burned. He quickly exonerates himself and basically leaves her out of this as well. It's just very interesting, the inference here that they who are rigid in censuring others are much more pliant in forgiving themselves. But you can see that he's starting to get it. And you can see that God is slowly working on his character, because he did not sleep with her again, right? Once he discovers who she is, he says, I'm not going to be guilty of incest. And I'm not going to do that. And so it's just very interesting here. But when we get to the final part of the story, and this is the real reason the story is mentioned here, God gave Tamar twins. Why do I say that's the biggest part of the story? Well, because of what I said in the introduction. The line of Judah continues. The line of Judah continues. In fact, if you want to know, once again, what God thinks about the whole thing, keep your finger here. I want to show you a couple of other really cool things. This is the way that God's word works. It kind of interprets each other, or God's word interprets itself. So go a few books over to the book of Ruth. I want to show you something really cool. Go to Ruth, right? Joshua, Judges, Ruth, right after the first 5 books of Moses. After Deuteronomy, you have Joshua, Judges, Ruth. And in Ruth, look at the last chapter of Ruth. I want to show you a really cool, I want to say, continuation of this story. If you know the story of Ruth, okay, it starts in the first chapter where A certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his sons were Mahlon and Chilion, and they both died. And one of his sons had a wife, and her name was Ruth. And when both of her sons died, Naomi says to her daughters-in-law, basically, I release you. Why don't y'all, you are released from your marriage covenant. You're free to go back and marry again, because by the law, by the customs, if your husband died, you can rightly marry someone else. And that's what Naomi does to Ruth and Orpah, the other daughter-in-law. Orpah leaves, Ruth stays with her and says, I'm gonna be with you, and your people are gonna be my people. And so Naomi and Ruth come back, and there's a wonderful man that they find. The reason I bring it up is because the law of levirate marriage comes back in here. There is a relative that they find who is well off. His name is Boaz, and Ruth basically approaches Boaz and asks him if he would be willing to fulfill his levirate marriage obligation. Boaz goes on ancestors.com and realizes there's one a little bit closer to Ruth, and so he goes in front of the city council, or the city gate in this particular situation, and formally asks the closer relative if he's willing to fulfill his obligation to Ruth. Now, I told you a second ago when we were talking about what Judah asked Onan to do, the only reason for that kind of marriage is to extend the line of the first person, right? So essentially, you have to be willing to be selfless. You have to be willing to sacrifice yourself and your name and your future for the sake of whosever name you're continuing. And so because of that, when Boaz asked the closer relative if he's willing to fulfill their responsibility, he said, no, go ahead. So Boaz takes on that responsibility. Now, I want to pause for just a second here. The way God works, right? I think it's very interesting how God works. Here are 2 dudes, Onan over there in the story of Judah, and this other dude, and his name is right here in Ruth, but for all intents and purposes, I don't recall his name off the top of my mind. I would have never been able to tell you the name of Onan if I hadn't been preparing for this particular message right now. But the name of Boaz, you can wake me up at any time of day or night, and I can tell you who Boaz was. And that's how God works. These 2 other dudes were not willing to continue someone else's line. They were not willing to set themselves down for the sake of doing the right thing. And God says, fine, I'm going to make your names wiped out. I'm going to make it to where no one in the history of, the faith is even going to know or remember who you are. But Boaz, who's willing to do the right thing and sacrifice his own name and fame and not reputation, but as far as just kind of, everyone remembering what his line was, what does God do? God says, you did the right thing. Everyone's going to remember who you are, Boaz. You're gonna fare very prominently in the story. But look at this. Just verse 11 of chapter 4 of Ruth. I wanted to read you this. This is so cool. So this is the end of that formal meeting in the city council, right? At the city gate, where Boaz formally states that he is willing to continue the line of Ruth, and he's willing to take her. And look at all the people, verse 11, Ruth 4:11. All the people who were in the court and the elders said, we're witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel. And may you achieve wealth in Ephrathah and become famous in Bethlehem. Keep on reading. This is so cool. Moreover, may your house be like the house of who? What? Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. What? We're right back to Genesis 38 here, aren't we? Through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her. Then the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today, and may his name become famous in Israel. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and became his nurse. The neighbor women gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." So they named him Obed. He's the father of who? Jesse. Who's the father of who? David. Yes, King David. Now, these are the generations of who? Perez. We're right back to Genesis 38, aren't we? The generations of Perez. To Perez was born Hezron. To Hezron was born Ram. To Ram, Aminadab. And to Aminadab was born Nahshon. To Nahshon, Salmon. And to Salmon was born Boaz. And to Boaz, Obed. And to Obed was born Jesse. And to Jesse, David. Is the story of Tamar well known in the Bible? You betcha. 10 generations from Judah, starting with Perez, we get to David. 10 generations. And so it's just such a cool thing. We see Onan unwilling to fulfill his obligation, evil in the sight of the Lord disposes of him. But Boaz, few generations later, is willing to sacrifice his own name and his own fame and his own legacy for the sake of doing the right thing. And God says, "Thank you, Boaz. Everyone's going to know who you are, even though you are technically laying your name down." But that's not it. I want to show you one more other thing. Are you ready? Matthew chapter 1. Go to the very first book of the New Testament. The very first chapter of the very first book of the New Testament. You're going to see something so cool there. The record of the genealogy of who? Jesus. You betcha. The record of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah. What does the Messiah mean in Hebrew? Anointed one. He's the one that God sent to Israel. Today, Israel, some Israelites are still mistakenly awaiting their Messiah, but because they had not realized that he had already come. They had not realized that because he had already come, and fulfilled the promises of the law, God had allowed the temple to be destroyed in AD 70. Why? Because there's no need for the temple. Jesus Christ had established a new way. But look at this, the record of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Son of David, he's the king. The son of Abraham, he's a true Jew. Matthew, being a disciple who wrote to the Jews, his gospel is written to the Jews. He wants to establish Jesus as the true king and the true Jew from the very first verses of his gospel. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brother. So you can see Judah becomes the firstborn or carries the firstborn blessing from Jacob, right? But keep on reading. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah. What? Genesis 38 all the way in Matthew? You mean that this insignificant little really strange story that we had to do some serious work to unpack in Genesis 38 makes it into the genealogy of Jesus? Yeah, that's exactly what I mean to tell you. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. And Tamar also makes the story. Perez was the father of Hezron, and so on. And we read now the same thing we just read in Ruth. I think it's very, very interesting how God and his plan works, right? This is God's breakthrough here. Even the name of Perez, which means breach or breakthrough, you can see that God has a breakthrough. And I think what's so significant here is, again, the connection with Judah's dealing with Joseph. He and his brothers sold their younger brother into Egypt, thinking they could thwart God's design, that the elder brothers would serve the younger Joseph. Yet in Judah's own family, God shows the opposite, right? And 10 generations, as we just learned, from Perez to David. Tamar, a wrong wife or Canaanite, saves the family by her loyalty to it. There are 4 women in Matthew's genealogy. In Matthew chapter 1, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, they all come from outside of Israel and have a highly irregular and potentially scandalous marriage union. But because of their faith, God deems them worthy to carry a royal seed. So this story really is kind of a beautiful picture of God's grace, right? How God allows his plan to go on even when the right people do the wrong thing and the wrong people do the right thing. Okay? So I just want us to understand that. And there, in God's plan, everybody is redeemable, right? God's grace is able to save anybody. And that's the beauty of it, is that if no matter what your background is, no matter what things you have done or what things we have done, if we, at any point of time, if we decide to change our allegiances to God's side, he can take us and redeem us and transform us. And he can take out of something that not in the best possible light, he can make out of that. He can bring out of that line the greatest king in Israel. And ultimately later, the one who saves the entire world, Jesus Christ. Isn't that interesting? Tamar, Perez mentioned in the genealogy of David and in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. What a wonderful story. Now you understand why Genesis 38 is there. Because the line of Judah is one of the most important lines in the Old Testament. The most important line coming out of Jacob. And that's why we need to see that Judah was not perfect. The reason his line is the most important line is not because Judah deserved it, but because of God's grace. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your grace. It is the same grace through which Judah's line arose to prominence, and it is the same grace through which each and every one of us is saved, by grace through faith. Nothing else. Nothing of our own accomplishment. Nothing of our own doing. Nothing of our